The upper limb runs from your deltoid to your hand, with 6 categories of muscles under your command. Throughout the pectoral region, shoulder and upper arm, your hand as well as the anterior and posterior forearm.
Good morning everyone. In this video we're going to talk about muscles, and we're going to see the links between muscles and respiration. The first thing we're going to study is the impact of training on the production of power. We're going to have a look at this graph here. On the y-axis we have ventilation, which is in liters per minute. On the x-axis we've got the production of power in watts. And two groups are compared. We have amateur athletes versus professional athletes. So maybe one figure could be interesting. We're just going to take one amount of air. So let's focus on if both athletes take in 100 liters per minute, will they produce the same amount of power? Well, the answer is no. In this study, they have shown that for a same intake of air, the power produced is not the same. We've got roughly just above 320 perhaps watts produced for amateur athletes, and almost 400, possibly 390 watts produced in the case of professional athletes. So just underneath your graph you have an analysis box you can complete. For the same amount of air taken in, a pro athlete will produce more power than an amateur athlete. For 100 liters per minute, 320 watts are produced by the amateur and 390 watts are produced by the professional. And as a conclusion, training muscles enables to produce more power. Indeed, for the same amount of O2 taken in, trained muscles generate more power. How can this be explained? Well, this can be explained by different factors. Trained muscles and bodies will have a greater capacity to take all the O2 and bring it to the muscles. So there'll be a better affinity. For example, there'll be more hemoglobins in the blood, so they will be taking more O2 within the muscle cells. Also, some cells will possibly be more efficient in doing respiration, and therefore they will be selected compared to cells which will be less efficient when they do respiration. Now then, we've talked about the differences in power production depending on training. We're going to go in a bit more detail now about different types of muscles used for different types of sports activities. So what I've done here, I'm going to play two extracts from Olympian athletes from two different races, and when you watch these races, I want you to focus on how long did each race last for, and try and think, well, are they using the same amount of energy? Are they using the same types of muscles? Try and think of all that when you watch these two sequences.
They get away first time. Tyson Gay right alongside Usain Bolt, but here he goes, streaking away already. It's Bolt all the way. He's looking round at Gay. Watch the...
A world record for the marathon!
Okay, you've just watched the two races. We're just going to do a few recaps. So race number one, we had Usain Bolt, who was running the 100-meter final, and he ran this 100 meters in 9.58 seconds, so quite a short time. And on the other hand, we had Bridget Coxey, she ran the marathon. A marathon is 42.195 kilometers, and it took her 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 4 seconds. So we've got 10 seconds on one side and 2 hours and 14 minutes on the other. So the question is, did Usain Bolt and Bridget Coxey, did they use the same type of muscles? Did they use the same type of energy breakdown? Well, the answer is no, and we're going to detail why and which muscle fibers have been used in the different races and where did the energy come from. Task. Using figure 10.2 and the graph from Bac exercise Bac 2010, identify the characteristics for each twitch muscle fibers. Let's do it. You need to know that there are two main types of twitch muscle fibers. There are the slow twitch ones and the fast twitch ones. Fast twitch muscle fibers are more for long distance running, so more of a long-term, more endurant. They produce less power, but they're more endurant. Whereas muscle fibers for fast twitch ones, for sprinting, they will generate more power, but they won't be very good for endurance. So this is what you could see in fast twitches, slow twitches. So the amount of red fibers and white fibers, which are the two main types, varies. There are more red fibers for long distance and endurance activities, and there are more white fibers for short activities, but which require more power. Now then, we've just seen that there were two types of fibers. We're going to try and learn a bit more and analyze this graph from Bac exercise 2010 and link it with what we've just seen. On the y-axis, we've got energy source of the cell in percentage, and on the x-axis, we've got time in seconds. So we can see that depending on how long a cell is going to need energy to function, so in the case of a muscle fiber to produce power, depending on how long the cell is going to need energy, it's not going to use the same resources in terms of energy. So you can see that if the effort is less than 15 seconds, in the cell there is an ATP reserve which is going to be directly used. So ATP molecules which are there and which are going to be used. Then there is a second thing called creatine phosphate. This one is going to be used up to a little bit more than a minute. Creatine phosphate is a molecule which has a phosphate group. Basically, this phosphate is going to be used to regenerate ATP, and the reserve of creatine or creatine phosphate will only last for a minute, roughly. Then after ATP and the creatine phosphate reserve have been used up, new production energy forms will be used, new metabolic pathways will be used. So you know them. If the effort goes roughly up to 2 minutes, it's going to be lactic fermentation. So, well, the same thing that bacteria in yogurts do. And if the effort lasts more than 2 minutes, then the organism is going to switch to aerobic respiration. So you know this quite well now. So glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. On the long term, for long activities which last more than 2 minutes, aerobic respiration will be the main metabolic pathway which will be used. This slide is for you to have a quick recap of the characteristics of the different types of muscle fibers. So the slow twitch, they are for long activities. They will do aerobic respiration. So type 1s is what marathon runners will be using. And fast twitch type 2 fibers, they are more for quick activities which require more power on a very short period of time. So that these are the type of fibers that sprinters will have. And just to link it with the previous graph, slow twitch type 1s, so they will tend to do aerobic respiration, whereas type 2, they will tend to use mainly the ATP and the creatine phosphate supplies, and they won't, maybe a little bit of lactic fermentation, but they will not be used in doing aerobic respiration. Number 11, different uses of ATP. In the syllabus, it is said that you need to know a few things in which ATP are used up. So I found this diagram from the bioninja.com internet site. So you have a few examples: biosynthesis of macromolecules, active transport, nerve transmission, growth and repair, movement, emission of light. And one way to remember these different activities, you've got this sentence "bag me," which are the first letters of all these examples. Number 12, food as a source of organic molecules. We saw previously that glucose was used in respiration through the Krebs cycle, glycolysis, etc. We're going to see that there are other sources of food, such as proteins and lipids, which also intervene in the Krebs cycle, and we'll see how in the next diagram. To illustrate what I've just said, we're going to use this Eurobio document. We're going to start by labeling a few things. G is for glycolysis, K is for the Krebs cycle, P is for oxidative phosphorylation. So you already know these big set of reactions. PYR is for pyruvate, and ACA is for acetyl coenzyme A. What we saw in the previous lessons is that glucose, so you can see that these hexagons show carbohydrates, so one of them is glucose. Glucose is going to be transformed into pyruvate through glycolysis, then into acetyl coenzyme A, and then it's going to enter the Krebs cycle. The new thing you're going to learn in this diagram is that fats that we have here and proteins, they will also be used in some way in the Krebs cycle. So fats, they are transformed through a reaction into acetyl coenzyme A, and then this acetyl coenzyme A will obviously go through the Krebs cycle. So fats, they can be used to produce acetyl coenzyme A. You've probably heard that when you do long-term exercise or very long period exercise, you end up burning fat. Well, this is exactly what's happening, is that after a while, when you've used up all the sugar, you're going to start using up fats and using them by transforming them into acetyl coenzyme A. And at the end of the day, you know that the Krebs cycle produces energy. So fats are used to produce energy via the Krebs cycle via acetocoenzyme A. Proteins now, you've probably recognized these round shapes which are amino acids. They are going to be used to either produce pyruvate, acetocoenzyme A, or directly an amino acid which intervenes in the Krebs cycle. Each time this happens, NH3 is going to be taken away from the molecule, and this is called deamination. We've almost finished with this diagram. We've got two things. Number 2 is dehydrogenation. It's simply the fact that the hydrogen here that has been lost, you know that protons, electrons are exchanged between molecules through oxidative reduction reactions. Well, these protons, hydrogen, will bind with dioxygen and we end up with water. So this is dehydrogenation, the fact that these molecules lose hydrogens. And the last thing is decarboxylation. You know that in the Krebs cycle, at some point CO2 is produced. Well, decarboxylation is simply the fact that molecules from the Krebs cycle are going to lose a carbon, and this carbon will be used in a sense to produce CO2. So that's what we could say on the uses of different foods. So you see that the Krebs cycle, oxidative respiration, is really a key metabolic pathway because all types of food will be used in a certain way within the Krebs cycle and oxidative respiration. This slide is simply to illustrate what deamination is. So we have a L-serine here. This is a amino acid. You can see that there is the characteristic NH3 group, COO group. At the end of the reaction, you end up with pyruvate. This molecule here is pyruvate, and you can see that pyruvate does not have a NH3 group, so this NH3 group will be lost at some point to produce pyruvate. This is one possibility, one example of deamination. Number 13, the carbon cycle. For the baccalaureate, you need to know the overview of the carbon cycle and be able to explain some key arrows in this diagram. So it looks like this. The idea is that carbon atoms are going to be transferred into different molecules, different organisms within this cycle. Let's have a look at some of the arrows. We have something here, an arrow which goes into trees, which goes from the atmosphere. So CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be taken into trees, plants. And you know this is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes in CO2 and will produce glucose, which will be used to build trees and plants, if I may say so. The arrow going the other way round, something which produces CO2, this is simply respiration. CO2 is going to be produced by plants which also do respiration. The same thing goes for water. It's not the water itself, but it's the algae and the animals which live in water. So when you've got CO2 coming in, that's going to be photosynthesis. And when you've got CO2, which is going to go from water to the atmosphere, so CO2 is produced, again, that is respiration, perhaps also fermentation, done by these plants and animals, which is going to release CO2 in the atmosphere. This point here is basically human activities. When we burn coal, petrol, produce cement, CO2 is going to be released in the atmosphere. When you think of it, coal is basically the transformation of ancient fossil ferns. So these ferns took CO2 from the atmosphere, incorporated it in the branches, the leaves. It got transformed into coal, which is really rich in carbon. So when you burn coal, this carbon is going to be released in the form of CO2. And you probably know that climate change, the fact that there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which increases the temperature, is due to this combustion of fossil fuels and, for example, production of cement. Two things we can say is that the fluxes are in GTC. This means gigatons of carbon, so in billion of tons of carbon per year. And in black we've got the storage. So for example, sediments, they will store carbon. You might know of limestone and chalk. They are rocks which are mainly made of CaCO3. This mineral, calcite, with a calcium atom, 1 carbon atom and 3 oxygens. This is one of the main minerals found in chalk and limestone. So these rocks act as reservoirs, as storage for carbon. Plants are also storage for carbon. And animals also, because in our muscles, bones, carbon is stored. So there are some places where carbon is stored, and we've got the arrows which shows the fluxes of carbons between these different storage areas or reservoirs. We've just said that in the carbon cycle, human activities produce CO2. For example, when fossil fuels are used. I just wanted to show you an example of what that means. In this case, we have the example of methane. Methane is a gas, CH4. You might have heard that cows' farts, in a way, produce methane. That is absolutely true. And you might have heard that cows' farts are one of the causes of climate change. It is true, but along with other things. So this fossil fuel methane, which is a gas, it will react with oxygen, and in the process carbon dioxide will be produced as well as water. This is a combustion reaction, and it's going to be the same principle for all fossil fuels. It might not always be the same quantity of dioxygen and CO2 being produced for each molecule, but this is the principle. You have one fossil fuel, and when you burn it, it's going to use up dioxygen, and CO2 is going to be produced. We have now finished this big topic on respiration, fermentation, use of ATP, carbon cycle, etc. Therefore, the next chapter will be about evolution. To end this video, I found a song on the carbon cycle. So I'll let you enjoy that and see you for the next video. Bye-bye.
I'm a carbon atom in a CO2 up in the air. In the air, in the air. Floating with the oxygen and nitrogen up there. Nitrogen and oxygen up there. There I'm gonna be until I'm sucked into a tree. Into the leaves of a tree. Photosynthesis captures me. Puts me in the leaves of a tree. Fixed to the leaves, I'm in a new situation. Now I'm a solid in a plant location. Cause photosynthesis does carbon fixation. Carbon fixation. Carbon cycle moving me around. Gaseous in the air and solid on the ground. Carbon cycle going round and round. Going round and round and round.